3 knocks. Sharp, measured. Not the kind a neighbor makes. Outside, blue and red strobes bounced off puddles. Unmarked car. 2 officers. The white one stepped forward. "Camilla Everett?" he said, like he was asking the time. Jameson had come to the hallway, barefoot, eyes wide. His voice was barely a whisper. "What's happening?" Camilla didn't answer him, not yet. The officer's voice was calm, rehearsed. "You're under arrest for child abduction and endangerment. You have the right to remain silent." And just like that, the air went thin. "No," Jameson said, louder this time, but they were already pulling her hands behind her back. She didn't fight, not with her body, but her eyes found his. "Go to Frank," she told him, steady as she could. "Tell him everything." The knock came again, harder this time. Not urgent, not panicked, just deliberate. Camilla sat up on the couch, heart racing before her feet even hit the floor. Jameson stirred on the mattress in the living room, one small hand still gripping the corner of the blanket, like he always did now. Tight, like if he let go, the world might vanish with it. The clock on the wall blinked 12:03 a.m. She pulled her robe around herself and stepped to the window. Rain was falling again, soft and steady. Street lamp flickers reflected in puddles. A dark car idled at the curb. Black. Government clean. Lights low. Another knock. She knew. She opened the door slowly. 2 white officers stood there, shoulders squared under rain-specked uniforms. The younger one held something in his hand, a folded paper in a plastic sleeve. But it wasn't a warrant. The older one spoke, voice steady like he was reciting from a card. "Ms. Camilla Everett, you are under arrest for child abduction and endangering a minor." Her breath caught. Jameson was already on his feet behind her, barefoot, eyes wide with confusion. "What? No, she didn't." He pushed past her, frantic. "She didn't take me, she—" The younger officer stepped forward. "Ma'am, please step outside." Camilla didn't argue. Didn't scream or curse or demand to see a lawyer. Not yet. Not in front of Jameson. She turned to him, knelt down slowly, ignoring the cold creeping in from the open door. "I need you to be brave now," she whispered. "Go to your grandfather. Tell him everything, every word." Jameson's chin quivered. "I want to go with you." "I know," she said, "but not tonight." She stood up and offered her wrists without protest. The cuffs were cold. Final. The hallway filled with the sound of metal and boots and muffled sobs as they led her out. Jameson tried to follow. Wait, she didn't do anything. Why won't you listen?" A third man stepped in from the shadows near the stairwell. A plainclothes officer with dead eyes and a smooth suit. He held up a hand, palm out. "Let the process work, kid," he said flatly, like he was talking about paperwork instead of people. The door slammed shut behind her. Jameson was left standing alone in the hallway, shaking. They didn't leave sirens on. They didn't want a scene, but the scene was already there. At the station, no one looked her in the eye. No one explained why there was no warrant. No one mentioned that the case had been moved up the chain, out of jurisdiction. Camilla sat in silence, fingers linked in her lap, back straight against the plastic chair like she was back in court again, waiting for a verdict she already knew. She could hear it in the air, the quiet hum of something bigger than justice. Somebody wanted her gone. By morning, the papers ran the headline, "Woman arrested in connection with missing child scandal." No name. Not yet. But the photo was hers, an old one from the protest years. She was holding a sign that said, "We deserve shelter too." The caption read, "Local agitator under investigation for unlawful custody." At the Wyatt estate, Jameson was back in the guest wing. A nanny had been called in. Professional, distant, trained in stability. Frank Wyatt sat at the end of a long dining table with cold coffee and a heavier silence. "She saved him," he said, voice low. Elaine folded her napkin with precise fingers. "She misled everyone. That's not saving." "She didn't lie," he said. Elaine gave a slow, polite smile. "No, Frank. She just didn't tell you the whole truth." Meanwhile, in her cell, Camilla didn't sleep. She replayed it all in her mind. The first night in the rain. The boy curled up by the dumpster, her hands holding bread instead of questions. She had done what she believed was right. Not legal, not clean, not safe, but right. The cuffs still left a dent in her wrist. She traced the mark with her thumb and closed her eyes. "They can take the body," she whispered to no one. "But they don't get the story." She didn't know if anyone would hear her, but she said it anyway, because silence had already taken enough from her. The holding cell was colder than she remembered. Not cold like air conditioning or open windows. Colder than that. Cold like memory. Like grief. Like the space between you and the world when you know you're not going to be believed. Camilla sat on the edge of the bench, the metal under her thighs too hard, too real. The lights above her flickered. Not broken, just old, just forgotten. Like the room itself. Forgotten. That word kept spinning in her chest. She folded her hands, kept her back straight, shoulders square. Not because she wanted to be strong, but because she knew how they looked at you when you didn't. "You okay in here?" the female guard had asked earlier, the way someone might ask a cardboard box if it minded the rain. Camilla hadn't answered, just nodded once. Just enough. Now, alone again, her eyes drifted to the concrete floor, to the faint scuff marks left behind by the last woman who sat there. Maybe longer ago, maybe not. And that's when it came back. The smell first, cigarettes, sweat, fear. Then the courtroom, the bench, the young man in the suit that didn't fit him. Hands too big for his lap, knees shaking as the verdict was read. Not guilty. That's what she'd begged the jury to say, but she'd known. From the moment she saw the prosecutor lean in and smile at the judge during recess. From the way the evidence box had already been closed before closing arguments were finished. From the silence in the jury room that lasted only 17 minutes. "I'm sorry," she'd whispered to the boy outside the courtroom. "I tried." He didn't answer. Just looked at her like maybe she had been part of it too. She remembered going home that night and peeling off her blazer like it was skin. Sitting on the floor in the dark with no music, no wine, no voice left. Only the sound of her own breathing and the knowledge that something in her had broken. And stayed broken. That was the last trial she ever took. And now here she was, on the other side of it. Not the attorney anymore. The defendant. Not the woman who fought for the ones nobody believed, but the woman nobody wanted to believe. A buzzer sounded. A sharp clack of keys. The cell door slid open. A man walked in. Younger than her, clean cut, nervous, holding a yellow folder with her name on it like it might catch fire. "Ms. Everett?" he asked, voice too high. She said nothing. "I've been assigned as your counsel," he continued. Temporary counsel. Until a formal arraignment. We'll file a preliminary response. Start building the narrative. Obviously, there's room for negotiation if we... Camilla raised a hand. He stopped mid-sentence. She looked up at him with eyes that didn't tremble. "I won't be needing you," she said. His brow furrowed. "Excuse me?" I said, "I won't be needing you." He looked around the empty room like maybe there was someone else she was talking to. But, with all due respect, you don't really have a choice. The system requires counsel. I don't need someone to speak for me," she said, slower this time. "I've done that my whole life." He hesitated, then placed the folder on the bench and backed out of the cell. The door slid shut again. Camilla stared at this folder a long time, then picked it up. Inside were glossy printouts of headlines, her old protest photos, court records with highlighted sections. The narrative was already written. They weren't interested in who she was, just who they could make her look like. She closed the folder and set it aside. They wanted to erase her, to flatten her into some angry stereotype. Poor black woman with a cause. Dangerous, unstable, convenient. She wasn't going to let them. She was tired. God, she was tired. But she remembered the boy, Jameson's face that night in the rain, his voice calling after her, his hand in hers, so small and certain. They'd taken him once, tried to lock him into silence. Now they wanted to do the same to her. She leaned back against the cold wall, exhaled slow. This time she wouldn't break. She would speak, and this time they would have to listen. The report was wrong. Marcus knew it the moment he read the third line. Not just wrong, rewritten, smoothed over, massaged into something that sounded clean enough for public record, but not too clean to raise suspicion. He sat alone in the cruiser, engine idling, the low hum of the heater pressing against the early spring chill. The street was quiet, just the flicker of a crosswalk light and the occasional rustle of wind through chain-link fence. He looked again at the paper. Same badge number, same call log. But not his words. He had been on duty that night. He remembered it. More than remembered. It had gnawed at him ever since. A dispatch came in. Anonymous call. Possible child sighting near the East 11th underpass. He drove out, lights off. A rainy night, thick with silence. He'd seen the boy, pale, standing too still. But before Marcus could get out of the car, another call came through. Override. Higher priority. Abandon location. No further action. He didn't forget, but he followed the command. You had to, back then. Especially when you were the only black officer in a department that smiled at you in the morning, but never invited you to lunch. Now, holding this rewritten report, Marcus could see his own name attached to a lie. Refused to investigate further, it read. That was all. He tore the page out, folded it, tucked it into his pocket like evidence. Because that's what it was now. Something was off, and not just with the paperwork. He had seen the news, seen the photo of the woman, Camilla Everett. Saw the tired in her eyes. Not the kind of tired that comes from a night in jail. Deeper. Like the kind you see in mothers waiting in courthouse hallways, holding shoes that don't fit their children anymore. And he saw the boy, the same face he'd seen that night. And he knew, without question, that kid didn't run away. He was removed, shifted, hidden. He made a decision that morning, quiet but sharp. He would go to the boy. Not through protocol, not through legal channels, just him. One black man, trying to follow the thread of something no one else wanted pulled. Jameson was at school. Not the fancy private one on the hill, but a transitional public placement. Temporary, they said. Safer, they said. Marcus parked across the street and waited until lunch break. He watched the boy emerge with the others, smaller than he remembered, thinner. He held his tray like it might disappear if he let go. Marcus approached slow, careful not to look official. He sat across from him on the bench outside the cafeteria, keeping his voice soft. Jameson Wyatt? The boy looked up, startled, hesitant. My name's Marcus, he said. I'm a police officer. I'm not here to scare you. I just want to know what really happened. Jameson didn't answer right away. He glanced toward the school doors, then down at his tray. She didn't take me, he said at last. She gave me a coat and bread, and she listened. Marcus nodded. I believe you. The boy looked at him again. Longer this time. They said I was confused, but I wasn't. I don't think you were, Marcus said. Jameson swallowed. His voice dropped. She told me not to remember. The woman with the red nails. Marcus's breath caught. She said the shot would help me sleep, and that nobody would care if I disappeared. Because I was extra, that word. Again, the way rich people used it like a stain they couldn't wash off their hands. Did she hurt you? Marcus asked gently. Jameson shook his head. Not like that, but she scared me. A lot. Marcus put a hand on the table, open and calm. You did good telling me this. I need your help to make sure no one else gets scared like that. The boy nodded. Do you remember where she took you? Jameson paused, then reached into his backpack, pulled out a folded drawing, crumpled, edges worn. It showed a house, big, too many windows, and a red car in the driveway. Marcus unfolded it carefully. "This yours?" Jameson nodded. "She didn't want me to keep it." Marcus stared at the house, not because he didn't recognize it, but because he did. He'd seen it once, years ago, during a security detail outside a donor gala. Elaine Wyatt's estate. That night, Marcus didn't go home. He sat in the station's back lot, engine off, staring at the drawing. He knew what it meant to be black and suspicious inside a white system, knew what it meant to speak up and be disciplined for insubordination. But this wasn't about his career anymore. It was about that boy, and the woman who dared to speak when the world had already decided she shouldn't. He opened his notebook, drew a line under the date. He would find the truth, even if it meant losing everything else. The room was designed to feel safe. Quiet carpet, cream-colored walls, a pitcher of water sweating on the tray like it was part of a therapy session instead of a legal mediation. But safety was a performance here. Frank Wyatt sat near the end of the long table, his hands folded in front of him like he was trying to hold something still. Not just his temper, maybe his doubt. Maybe the strange ache that had started to follow him every time he saw Jameson and thought about what had been done in his name. Across from him sat two attorneys, neither from his firm, handpicked by Elaine. That was important. She wanted this to look neutral, but it wasn't. Nothing was. Elaine entered the room last. White coat, pearl earrings, her hair pulled back so tightly it made her expression hard to read. She didn't sit right away, just laid a single folder on the table and looked directly at Frank. "This isn't about blame," she said, voice even. "It's about recovery. Jameson needs support, and we're not going to get it from that woman." Frank didn't answer. He opened the folder slowly. Inside, a typed evaluation from a licensed psychologist. One he didn't recognize. The language was precise, almost sterile. Exhibits signs of emotional confusion, attachment disorder symptoms, potential trauma due to prolonged exposure to unstable environments. Frank looked up. "Who wrote this?" Elaine's lips curved slightly. "Dr. Nelson. Highly respected, trauma-informed, discreet. I've never heard of him." "Well, you don't move in those circles," she replied gently, like she was reminding him of something he'd forgotten. The male attorney cleared his throat. "There's a recommendation here. Temporary no contact with Ms. Everett. Intensive therapy. Re-establishing familial trust within primary guardianship." Frank leaned back in his chair. The words felt clean. Too clean. "He's 8, he said. "He's not broken." Elaine's voice tightened. "No one said he was broken. But he's confused. He's been manipulated. You've seen how he clings to her. Because she listened to him. He's a child. Children don't always know what's good for them." Frank's jaw flexed. "And adults do?" For a moment, no one spoke. Then Elaine shifted tactics, her tone softening. "Look, Frank, I know you're overwhelmed. You didn't ask for any of this. But we have to think long-term. Jameson needs structure, not sentiment. And Camilla Everett, she's not qualified." "She's not qualified," he repeated. "But she fed him, sheltered him, talked to him like he mattered. Not like he was an inconvenience." Elaine's face stiffened. "You're letting your guilt speak louder than your logic." Frank stood abruptly. "I'll speak to Jameson myself, then we'll decide." That evening, he found the boy in the library. Curled in the corner chair, knees to chest, flipping pages of a book he wasn't reading. Frank sat across from him, slow, careful. "Hey," he said. Jameson didn't look up. "They said I'm not allowed to see her." "I know. They said it's for my mind, that I'm confused." "Do you feel confused?" Jameson shook his head. "She told me I matter. Nobody else ever said that." Frank exhaled. "Do you trust her?" Jameson finally looked at him. She listened. Those two words stuck. She listened. Not argued. Not defended. Just listened. Frank thought about all the times he hadn't. 2 days later, the official decision came down, signed off by a quiet judge who owed a few favors and wanted no headlines. Camilla was barred from contacting Jameson. No phone calls, no letters, no visits. Elaine arranged for specialized care, a private clinic just outside the city. Clean rooms, smiling staff. He'd have therapy 3 times a week, art sessions, structured meals. Jameson said nothing when they told him, just nodded once and packed his small bag. He kept the drawing, though, the one he'd made of Camilla's kitchen, with the crooked window and the chipped mug on the table. He didn't show it to anyone, just folded it tight and tucked it in his sock. As they pulled away in the car, he turned to the window. The sky was gray again, the kind of gray that never broke into rain, just hung heavy, waiting. In her cell, Camilla felt it before she knew it, like something had been cut off, like air leaving a room. She stared at the wall and whispered, "They've got him." She didn't cry, but she closed her eyes and promised herself out loud this time, "They won't keep him." They made her enter from the side hallway, not through the front, like someone who still had a name. Camilla stepped into the courtroom and felt every pair of eyes slice into her. Not like curiosity, not like sympathy, like evaluation, like stripping something down to its parts. Skin, background, posture, the way she walked in flats instead of heels. She didn't flinch. The courtroom wasn't new to her. But this side of the table, it was colder. The air had a different weight to it when you sat behind the defense nameplate and not in front of it. She kept her hands folded in her lap, steady. At the prosecution table, 2 attorneys whispered without looking at her. A man and a woman, both polished to perfection. The kind of polish that came from old schools and expensive mentors and not needing to explain where your parents went to college. A large screen had been wheeled in. The first image that flashed up wasn't her mugshot. It was a photo from a protest 10 years ago. Her arms raised, mouth open mid-chant. Her face younger, sharper, alive with something that hadn't yet been stripped down by the years. "This is the woman in question," the prosecutor said, his voice dry and precise. "A history of radical ideology, anti-institutional behavior, and an apparent willingness to manipulate minors for personal gain." Camilla blinked slowly. The next slide. A tweet from 2016. Something about housing inequality. "No family should live in a shelter while penthouses sit empty." He read it like an accusation. "Would you say this tweet reflects your feelings about the legal system?" he asked, as if she were already on the stand. She didn't answer. Not yet. Then came the photos. A protest where she'd been arrested, never charged. A clip from an interview where her words were cut mid-sentence. A flyer with her name on it from a community justice group that had folded years ago. A whole narrative, stitched together with old thread and lies. They were painting her as unstable, not because she was unstable, but because she had dared to be angry. And she had spoken that anger in public. Her court-appointed attorney leaned over and whispered, "We can object to the relevance." She shook her head. When the prosecutor sat down, Camilla stood. She didn't wait to be called, didn't ask for permission. "I'll be speaking for myself," she said. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Ms. Everett, are you waiving counsel?" "Yes," she said, respectfully. "You understand the risk?" She nodded. "I've known the risk my whole life." The room shifted. Not loudly, just the quiet murmur of people realizing this wasn't going to be the usual script. She walked to the center of the room. No podium, just herself. "I was once a lawyer," she said. "I still know the law, and I know how it's used against people like me." The air thinned. The jury didn't move. Not even the woman in the third seat who'd been fiddling with her bracelet since the start. "I know what you've seen," Camilla continued. "Photos, sound bites, headlines that make me look like a threat. And maybe that's easier to believe than the truth. But you don't need a degree to tell when someone's being erased. You just need to pay attention." She turned slightly, letting her eyes sweep the room. "I didn't kidnap that boy. I fed him. I sat with him while he shook in his sleep. I kept him safe when no one else even noticed he was gone. One of the prosecutors stood. Your Honor, she's giving testimony, the judge said quietly. Let her speak. Camilla kept going. I've seen what this system does to people who don't fit its comfort zone. People without money, without power. People with names you forget when the story ends. She turned to the jury now. You don't have to like me. You don't even have to believe I did everything right. But if you can look me in the eye and say that protecting a child is a crime, then maybe it's not me you should be judging. Silence. Then the judge called recess. The attorneys huddled. Camilla returned to her seat, her breath even, her hands still folded, still steady. No one spoke to her, but she saw it. The beginning of something cracking. Not justice. The courtroom had grown quieter as the hours dragged on. Not the respectful kind of silence, but the tense, waiting kind. Like everyone in the room could feel something shifting beneath their feet, and nobody wanted to be the first to admit it. Camilla sat still at her table. Her fingers, folded tight, rested on a legal pad she hadn't written on. Her voice had been the only one cutting through the earlier haze, and though she hadn't raised it, something in it had left a mark. She saw it now on the jurors' faces, the way they blinked slower, listened longer, still skeptical maybe, but not untouched. Then the door in the back creaked open. A pair of polished shoes appeared first, then the sharp navy line of a suit. Marcus stepped in like a man who wasn't sure if he'd be allowed to stay, but wasn't going to leave unless someone made him. Camilla turned slightly. Recognition flickered in her eyes, but she said nothing. The judge raised his chin. Can we help you, officer? Marcus nodded once. Your Honor, I have information directly related to this case. With the court's permission, I'd like to present evidence, recorded, time-stamped, and relevant to the current custody narrative. The prosecution shot to their feet. This is highly irregular. Irregular, Marcus said calmly, is a boy being hidden in a private estate under fabricated diagnoses, and no one asking where the paperwork came from. The judge leaned back, studying him. Go on. Marcus stepped forward, pulled a small recorder from his coat, and placed it gently on the evidence table. This is from a conversation between Elaine Wyatt and Dr. Nelson, the psychologist whose evaluation was used to justify Ms. Everett's no-contact order. He pressed play. The audio crackled. Then came the unmistakable voice of Elaine, cool, composed, as if she were discussing the placement of a centerpiece. We need the language to be clear, she said. Attachment disorder, environmental instability. I don't care what label you choose, just make sure it points away from her and toward trauma. There was a pause. Then the doctor's voice, nervous. He seems fine. I mean, emotionally, I don't see. You're not being asked to see, Elaine snapped. You're being paid to document. Someone in the courtroom gasped. One of the jurors looked over at another, eyes wide. The prosecution attorneys froze mid-note. Camilla closed her eyes. It wasn't relief. Not yet. But it was something like breath. Marcus turned to the judge. This is just one recording. There are others. Transcripts. Bank transfers. I followed the trail. There was no mental health concern. Only a coordinated attempt to discredit a woman who did nothing but care. The courtroom shifted. You could feel it. Even the cameras, silent, perched at their designated corners, seemed suddenly uncertain about where to focus. Frank stood. He hadn't spoken all day, had barely blinked through the testimonies and accusations and polished projections of who Camilla was supposed to be. But now his voice carried. She didn't raise him, he said, nodding toward Elaine. She tried to erase him. Elaine, seated stiffly behind her lawyers, turned pale. Her jaw moved, but no words came. Camilla watched her. Not with triumph, just with the kind of calm that only comes after too many nights of holding your breath in the dark. The judge cleared his throat. This court will take a brief recess. Mr. Marcus, please remain for follow-up testimony. The gavel dropped. Whispers broke out immediately. Not just in the room, but online. Reporters tapping at phones, murmurs of cover-up and tampered reports, and Wyatt family scandal already leaking through the courtroom walls like water through cracks. Camilla stood, slowly. Her knees felt unsteady, but her spine did not. Marcus walked over to her, not close, just enough. "I should have come forward sooner," he said quietly. "You came when it counted," she replied. He nodded once. "It's not over." "No," she said, her voice low. "But it's the first time someone believed me before the end." Outside the courtroom, the sky had shifted. Not bright, but lighter than it had been. And inside, for the first time, Camilla wasn't the only one holding the truth. The courtroom had never felt this still. Not even the air moved. Jameson stood at the front, just barely tall enough to see over the witness stand. Someone had placed a small footstool under the bench so his shoes wouldn't swing. He wasn't wearing a blazer, just a button-down shirt and soft gray pants that wrinkled at the knees when he sat. His hands trembled as they gripped the edge of the seat, but his eyes didn't move. Camilla watched from across the room, her fingers pressed together, her chest rising shallowly with each breath. She wanted to run to him, hold him, pull him back into the quiet space where no one asked for details. But this was the moment they'd both been walking toward, the one they couldn't run from. The prosecutor approached with caution, like one wrong tone might send the boy into silence. "Jameson," he began, voice low, "do you remember the night you left your home?" Jameson didn't answer right away. He looked down at his hands, then lifted his gaze and said, quietly but clearly, "I didn't leave. I was told to be quiet and go to the room with no window." The courtroom shifted. Not a murmur, not yet, but something moved in the air. The prosecutor looked back at his notes. "Who told you that?" Jameson's eyes didn't waver. "Elaine, your stepmother?" He nodded. "She said I was making things complicated, that it'd be easier for everyone if I just went to sleep." "Did she give you something to help you sleep?" Jameson hesitated, then softly, "A needle. In my arm." Camilla's throat caught. She could feel the tears pressing up behind her eyes, but she kept them in. He needed to see her strong. For just a little longer, the prosecutor tried to pivot. "And after that, what do you remember?" Jameson looked toward the jury now, like he'd rehearsed this. Not the words, but the courage. "I remember being cold. I remember trying to scream and nothing came out. And then, I remember the rain. And Camilla. She gave me bread. She didn't ask who I was. She just said, 'You're safe now.'" A tear slipped down Camilla's cheek. She didn't wipe it. The defense rose to cross-examine. The lead attorney, a man in his 50s with a voice like polished glass, approached slowly. "Jameson, you've been through a lot. Sometimes when children experience trauma, they confuse—" "I'm not confused," Jameson interrupted. The room froze again. The man blinked. "You're saying you remember everything?" "Yes." His voice cracked a little, but he steadied it. "Even the way she looked at me like I was nothing." Elaine, seated behind her attorneys, shifted sharply. Her face, pale, tight, twitched. She said, "You're just extra," Jameson continued. "She said nobody would miss me." Elaine stood. "That is not true!" The judge banged the gavel. "Mrs. Wyatt, you'll remain silent." But Elaine didn't sit. Her voice had risen, sharp and shaking. "This is ridiculous! He doesn't know what he's saying! He's a child!" Jameson turned to her, quiet, unflinching. "You never asked if I was scared," he said. Camilla did. The room held still. Somewhere in the gallery, a woman sobbed. A juror wiped her eye. Elaine opened her mouth again, but her lawyer pulled her back down. Too late. The court recorder had caught every word. So had every reporter, every camera. And Frank Wyatt sat with his head in his hands, not speaking, not moving, like a man who had just realized the weight of his own silence. Camilla finally let herself breathe, not deeply, not fully, but enough, because for the first time, The story wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to the boy who remembered everything. The courtroom was silent in that unnatural way, like everyone had forgotten how to breathe at the same time. The judge adjusted his glasses, then lowered the sheet of paper in his hand with a kind of reverence, not for the document itself, but for the weight of what it carried. His eyes moved across the room slowly, resting on Camilla for the briefest second, just long enough to acknowledge that she was still standing and still alone. In the matter of the state versus Camilla Everett, he began, this court finds the defendant not guilty on all charges. It wasn't dramatic. There were no gasps, no cheers, no tears being shed in loud, visible ways. Just a silence that broke like ice, slow cracks spidering through the room as people looked at one another, unsure of what they were now allowed to feel. Camilla didn't move. She didn't even blink. Her fingers stayed folded on the table in front of her, steady as they had been since the beginning. It was only when the judge added, "Ms. Everett is hereby released from all court-imposed restrictions and may pursue legal action if she so chooses," that she exhaled. She wasn't shackled, but she was still carrying something. The judge tapped the gavel once, sharp, final, and just like that, it was over. At least the part that fit inside the courtroom. The rest, the damage, the memory, the years it took to build a name that had been dragged through dust in a matter of weeks, that would come later. Elaine didn't speak. She sat stone still behind her counsel, her eyes dry and unreadable, though the color had drained from her face. She didn't look at Camilla, not once. Frank did. He stood, walked toward Camilla slowly, and nodded once. "I should have listened sooner," he said, his voice low. She didn't nod back, just said, "Now you have to decide who you're still protecting." 2 hours later, the headlines began to shift, first local, then national. All charges dropped in Wyatt custody case. Whistleblower cop uncovers hidden scheme. Stepmother accused of orchestrating mental health fraud. Details emerged quickly, too quickly for Elaine to stop them this time. Emails, financial records, testimonies from other parents whose children had been referred to the same private psychologist for subtle behavior issues, only to disappear quietly into clinics or distant boarding schools. It wasn't just about Jameson anymore. Elaine's name, once gold-plated on donor walls and event invitations, now trailed behind words like criminal inquiry and civil liability. Her world had been clean, controlled. Now it was cracking open. Marcus stood outside the courthouse steps, flanked by press cameras, but his eyes searched only for one person. When he spotted Camilla walking out, coat buttoned, shoulders squared against the wind, he stepped toward her, not as an officer, not as a hero, just as a man trying to make something right. "They're putting me in for lieutenant," he said, half smiling. "You earned it," she said, her voice warm but tired. "They said my testimony turned the whole case." Camilla tilted her head. It wasn't just that. "No, she said. "It was that you showed up when nobody else would." He nodded. "You gonna sue him?" She looked at the courthouse behind her. "I might. Not for the money. Just so they don't do it to someone else." Then she added quieter, "I want my name back." "You never lost it," Marcus said. "They just tried to make you forget it." That evening, Camilla sat in her small kitchen again. The lights hummed faintly overhead. The floor creaked the way it always had. Jameson sat at the table drawing. This time he wasn't sketching houses with too many windows or cars with no drivers. He was drawing Camilla, not perfectly. His hand was still learning. But the eyes were there, sharp, still, strong. When he finished, he turned the page around and pushed it toward her. "Is this what you look like when you win?" he asked. Camilla smiled and shook her head gently. "This is what I look like when I remember who I am." And outside, for the first time in weeks, the sky let go of the clouds. The television glowed softly in the corner, casting light over the chipped coffee table and the quiet room around it. A Sunday news segment had just begun, part of a new series called The Unseen, Stories That Deserved Better. This week it was about her. Camilla didn't move. She stood in the kitchen doorway, arms folded, watching as the screen faded into a still shot of the courthouse where it had all begun. Then, slowly, the voiceover began. Gentle, steady, like someone reading a bedtime story to an adult who'd survived the fire. Camilla Everett was never meant to be the center of a headline, the reporter said. She was meant to disappear, quietly, efficiently. But she didn't. And because she didn't, a little boy found his way back to the truth. The image shifted. A photo of Jameson appeared, smiling beside her in front of a small law office. The painted sign above the door read, Everett Legal Aid and Advocacy. That had been her first promise after the trial. She wouldn't go back to the firm, wouldn't chase prestige. She'd open something here, in the neighborhood that knew her, where people came not with suits, but with shoes worn through. Jameson was now enrolled at a regular school. No guards, no gated walls. Just a backpack, a public bus, and a boy learning to be a child again. But what the segment didn't show, not yet, was the letter that had come 2 weeks earlier. It had arrived in a plain envelope, slipped under the office door just after sunrise. She'd recognized the handwriting instantly. It was from Jameson's father. Camilla had never told Jameson the full story. Not until now. His father, Elliot, had once been the bridge between two worlds. The son of a magnate who'd married a woman who didn't come from wealth, didn't care for it, and didn't last long within its cold walls. After Jameson was born, and Elliot remarried, things changed. Quietly. Then quickly. He wasn't a cruel man, but he was weak, easily swept under the current of expectation, image, and Elaine's calculated charm. When the truth about Elaine started surfacing during the trial, the news began to circle back to Elliot. His silence was suddenly harder to defend. The letter was short, careful, but not cold. I should have fought harder, he wrote. I was afraid of losing everything, and in doing that I lost my son. I thought staying quiet would keep the peace, but silence didn't protect him. You did. Thank you. At the bottom, one more line, messier than the rest. When he's ready, I'll be here. If he ever wants to ask me why I left. Camilla hadn't given the letter to Jameson yet. Not because she was hiding it, but because she was waiting for the right time. That morning, as they sat on the porch, sipping cocoa and listening to a neighbor's radio play soul music from 2 blocks away, Jameson looked up and said, Do I look like him, my dad? Camilla smiled gently. A little, but mostly, you look like yourself. He thought about that for a moment. Did he leave because of me? Her voice was quiet. No, baby. He left because he didn't know how to stay. Jameson nodded, more grown up than he should be. If I meet him, I'm not going to be mad. I just want to ask if he remembers my laugh. Camilla's chest ached, but she only said, He remembers. He just forgot how to show it. Later that day, back at the office, Camilla found a white envelope waiting on her desk. No stamp, no name. Just her name. Handwritten, soft. Inside, one folded note. Because of you, I stayed. No signature, no explanation, but she didn't need one. She slipped the note into her drawer, beneath a growing pile of others like it. From clients, from strangers, from people who had once almost let the world forget them. That night, Jameson curled up beside her on the couch, the TV still playing soft news in the background. Do you ever miss it? He asked. The courtroom, the fancy job. Camilla smiled without looking away from the screen. Sometimes, but not the part they loved. I miss the part where someone got to tell their story and someone else actually listened. He leaned his head on her shoulder. You think they're still scared of you? She laughed once. Let them be. A moment passed. Then he whispered, You talk a lot, you know. I've been told. Good, he said. Don't stop. Outside, the wind moved soft through the trees, the kind that reminded her of that first night, rain falling like memory. Only now, there was no fear in it, no hush, because when a woman like Camilla speaks, and the world finally listens, you can silence a voice, but you can't silence the truth. We'll see you again in our next story, where another quiet moment might hold a powerful lesson. If this one moved you, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next truth waiting to be told.